Late at night, when everyone was fast asleep, something very strange happened. A man, dressed in old, torn clothes, was seen sneaking into a dark and mysterious place. This wasn't just any place, it was a secret spot in the forest, where no one ever goes. It looked like an old shrine or altar, and it had all sorts of weird things on it. There were strange statues, candles burning in the dark, and, most unusually, piles of shiny, colorful objects that looked like charms or magical items. But what made this scene even more shocking was what the man did next. Instead of just walking past the altar or maybe looking at the strange items, he actually went up to one of the charms and, to everyone's surprise, began licking it. It wasn't a joke or something fun. He was serious. His eyes were wide, and he looked like he was desperate. People who were nearby saw him from a distance and couldn't believe their eyes. Why would anyone lick a charm? What was he trying to do? Was he trying to get rich? Or was he trying to call on some dark force for help? No one knew. As the man continued licking the charm, the air around him seemed to grow heavy, almost like something magical was happening. It was like he was willing to do anything, even the strangest thing, to change his life. But little did he know, this night would lead him down a path that was much darker and more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The whispers of the forest seemed to speak to him, warning him, but he didn't hear. The man was too focused on the power he thought he could gain. Everyone in the village knew about the charms. They were said to hold incredible power. Some believed that if you could get close to the right one, you could make your biggest wishes come true. Whether it was for wealth, love, or power, these charms were said to be magical and connected to forces no one understood. But no one ever dared to touch them. The elders often warned people not to get too close, saying that these charms weren't for just anyone. They were meant to be handled only by those who understood their true power and the dangerous consequences that could follow. People who tried to use the charms for selfish reasons often found themselves in trouble. But the man at the altar didn't care about warnings. All he could think about was how his life was falling apart. He had no money, no job, and no way out. He had heard stories of people who used the charms to get rich overnight. The man thought that if he could just touch them, even lick them, he could have all the wealth he ever dreamed of. Maybe he would never have to worry again. Maybe he could finally live the life he always wanted. His hands shook as he reached out to grab another charm, his heart pounding. But as soon as his fingers touched the charm, something strange began to happen. A cold breeze blew through the forest, and the flames of the candles flickered wildly. The moment the man touched the charm, a wave of coldness washed over him. It wasn't just the cold air from the breeze. It was as if the charm itself had sent a chill straight through his bones. He tried to pull his hand away, but it felt like something was holding him there. His fingers were stuck to the charm, and he couldn't move. Panic started to rise in his chest. He thought maybe he was just imagining things, but no, this was real. The forest seemed to come alive, with strange noises echoing around him. The trees creaked and groaned, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift. The man felt a sharp, painful sensation in his chest, like something was digging into his heart. His mind raced. Was this the price he had to pay for trying to use the charm? Was this the curse that came with it? He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred, and he stumbled back from the altar, falling to the ground. The charms on the altar started to glow even brighter, casting an eerie light across the forest. It felt like the whole world was closing in on him. He wanted to run, to get away from this place, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the charms had trapped him in their spell. And then, the whispers started. They weren't voices he could hear with his ears. They were inside his head, speaking in a language he didn't understand. It was a language of power and darkness. The man's heart raced even faster. What was happening? Had he made a terrible mistake? The man lay there, his body trembling, his mind clouded with confusion and fear. He couldn't escape the whispers, they were too loud now. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but the whispers were so real, so clear. And then, in the middle of the darkness, a voice spoke. It wasn't like any voice the man had ever heard before. It was deep and powerful, like the voice of the forest itself. You sought power, the voice said, but power comes with a price. The man's heart skipped a beat. Was he dreaming? Was this some kind of nightmare? Who are you? He managed to whisper, his voice weak and shaky. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it began to tell him stories of those who had come before him. Stories of people who had tried to use the charms for their own selfish desires. Most of them had paid the price with their lives. You are not the first to come, the voice continued. But you will be the last. You have chosen the path of greed, and now you must face the consequences. The man felt a cold sweat cover his body. He tried to crawl away, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. The whispers grew louder, filling his head with images of darkness. Suddenly, he could see shadows moving around him, twisting and changing shape, like ghosts in the mist. The man's fear grew with every passing second. He could feel the curse taking hold of him, and he didn't know how to fight it. His mind raced as he remembered the stories of people who had tried to escape after touching the charms. Some of them had vanished without a trace, while others had returned, changed, and lost forever. The man didn't want to end up like that. He tried to break free, to run back to the village and forget all about this terrible night. But as he attempted to stand, his body refused to obey. The ground seemed to pull him back down, and he fell onto his knees. Please, he whispered, I didn't mean it. I just wanted a better life. But the voice in the darkness only laughed. You should have thought of that before, the voice said, it's stone cold and unforgiving. Now you will learn what true power cost. With all his strength, the man tried to stand again, but this time, something different happened. A dark shadow seemed to rise from the ground, wrapping around his body like chains. The harder he struggled, the tighter the shadow pulled. He could feel the power of the charm tightening its grip on him, pulling him deeper into its curse. The man's breath quickened as the dark shadows tightened their grip around him. It felt as if the very air around him was squeezing him, choking him. Each time he tried to break free, the shadows only grew stronger, wrapping around his limbs like chains of cold steel. The whispers in his mind were deafening now, a mix of laughter and mocking words. You think you can take what isn't yours, the voice sneered, echoing through his skull. Power isn't free. Power doesn't come without a price. And now, you will pay. Desperation flooded the man's chest. His heart raced so fast it hurt. He tried to scream for help, but the curse held him silent. His limbs were heavy, like they were filled with lead, and his chest felt as though it was being crushed by an invisible force. He wanted to run, to escape, but his body wouldn't move. Through the dark mist, the man thought he saw something moving, something huge. It was hard to tell in the gloom, but it looked like a dark figure, a giant shadow. It stepped toward him, and as it did, the air seemed to grow even colder. The shadows wrapped tighter around the man, as if the figure was commanding them, forcing them to tighten their hold. The man could feel the darkness getting closer, surrounding him from all sides. Suddenly, the figure's shape became clearer. It wasn't a person at all, it was something monstrous, something ancient. Its form was made of swirling black smoke and shifting shapes, its eyes glowing red like two burning embers. The man's heart stopped. Was this the thing behind the curse? Had he summoned it by licking the charm? With a slow, deliberate movement, the shadow reached out, its hand-like appendage stretching toward him. The man's body screamed in terror, but his mouth remained locked. His mind was flooded with visions of the creature's terrible power, it was no god, no force of nature. It was something far worse, something ancient, something evil, that thrived on the desperation and pain of those who dared to seek power. The shadow hovered above the man, who could only look up, his face pale with fear. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a still, suffocating silence. The creature's eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. "Do you understand now?" the voice said, its deep tone echoing in the man's chest. "You sought to claim what wasn't yours, and now, you will understand the cost of your greed." The man tried to speak, but the dark force surrounding him wouldn't let him. Instead, he felt a strange pressure in his mind, like the creature was reading his thoughts. It could feel his desperation, his regret. Slowly, the shadow's grip loosened just enough for the man to breathe again, but he still couldn't move. He could barely think, so overwhelmed was he by the terror flooding his senses. The creature chuckled darkly, a sound that sent chills down the man's spine. "You have a choice," it said. "You can stay here, trapped forever, consumed by darkness. Or, you can make a deal. A bargain." The man blinked, his mind spinning. A deal? What kind of deal? What could he possibly offer to something so powerful, something so ancient? "Anything," the shadow continued. "You want wealth. You want power. You want to change your life. But what are you willing to sacrifice for it?" The man's mind raced. Sacrifice. What could he give up? Everything he had was already broken. He had nothing left to offer, nothing to lose. Or did he? His family, his soul, could he offer that? Could he sell his very soul for the chance to escape the curse and have everything he ever dreamed of? The shadow seemed to sense his hesitation and leaned closer. "Do you want to live a life of luxury, or do you want to live at all?" The man's thoughts swirled in a panic. Could he trust this creature? Should he even try to bargain with something so dangerous? But then, in a moment of desperation, he remembered his old dreams, his wish for wealth, a better life. Was he willing to give up his soul for it? Was he really willing to do whatever it took to escape this dark fate? The choice was his. But could he make the right one? The man's heart raced as the shadow loomed above him, its eyes burning into his very soul. It seemed to wait, to give him time to think. Every part of him screamed to refuse, to fight back, but another part, the part that had been hungry for wealth and power, urged him to accept the bargain. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision bearing down on him. His mind raced, but all he could see was the life he had always dreamed of: money, luxury, freedom from worry, from poverty. But the price, his soul, his life, seemed too high. Could he really go through with it? Could he risk everything for a moment of power? "Do you think it's worth it?" the creature's voice whispered again, now calm and cold. "One moment of glory, one moment of wealth, in exchange for everything you are. Your family will be rich. Your name will be known. But you will belong to me." The man closed his eyes, the temptation gnawing at his resolve. He could feel the darkness closing in again, as if the shadow was pulling him in, coaxing him to take the deal. The whispers were faint now, but they still carried that promise: a life of wealth, a life of power. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. Could he turn back? Was there a way out of this? Maybe he should run. But his legs were still like stone, his body frozen. The only choice left was to accept the deal or remain trapped in this place forever. "Make your decision," the creature said, its voice suddenly sharp, full of power. "The moment will pass. The choice is yours. Will you claim what you desire, at the cost of your very soul?" The man's lips parted, and though his body trembled, his heart was resolute. The bargain was too sweet, too tempting. What was one soul, after all, when weighed against a lifetime of wealth? His voice broke the silence: "I accept your offer." As soon as the words left the man's lips, the ground beneath him trembled. A powerful force swept through the air, pushing him back. The shadows that had held him in place dissipated as if they were never there. For a moment, the man felt a rush of relief. He could move. He could breathe. He had made the deal. But then, everything around him began to change. The altar shimmered with a dark, unnatural light, and the forest seemed to grow even more ominous. The shadows in the trees twisted and turned, as if coming alive. The man stood up shakily, feeling a strange sensation wash over him. His body felt lighter, but at the same time, something deep within him felt wrong. Hollow. The shadow's voice echoed through the air once more, but this time, it was different. The creature's tone was one of satisfaction, almost like a father watching his child take their first steps into a dark world. Remember, the voice warned, you wanted power. You wanted wealth. But there is always a price. You are mine now. And your life will never be the same. As the words of the creature echoed in his mind, the man's heart pounded. He had made the deal. He had accepted the offer of wealth and power, but he had not fully understood what that meant. The air around him felt charged, like the weight of his decision was settling in, heavy and suffocating. The forest, which had once seemed like a dark but familiar place, now felt alien and hostile. The trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like bony fingers, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe in unnatural ways. For a moment, he stood there, unsure of what to do. His body felt different, lighter, almost as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But at the same time, something felt wrong, something was missing. It was as if the part of him that had once been whole, that had once been human, had slipped away, leaving an empty shell behind. Suddenly, he felt an intense pull in his chest, as if something was dragging him away from the altar. The ground beneath his feet shifted, and he stumbled, trying to catch his balance. Before he knew it, he was moving faster, his legs carrying him through the dark forest as though they had a mind of their own. He could feel the power coursing through him, but it wasn't the kind of power he had imagined. It was raw, uncontrolled, like an endless rush of adrenaline. The man looked around, confused, wondering where he was being pulled to. His mind raced as he realized that his body was no longer responding to him in the way it had before. His eyes darted around, searching for anything familiar, but the world around him seemed to shift with every step he took. The trees were changing, the ground beneath him became slick and treacherous. The darkness was swallowing everything, leaving only the faintest glimmers of light. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, watching him approach. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and had the same red eyes that he had seen before, the eyes of the shadow creature. It wasn't a man or a woman, but something else entirely. The figure's presence was overwhelming, like a storm brewing in the air. It moved toward him, slowly, with an almost hypnotic grace. "You have come," the figure said in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions, reverberating through the trees. The man froze, feeling a cold sweat form on his forehead. This was no ordinary figure, it was something far worse. The presence was suffocating, and yet, he couldn't look away. "You sought power, and now you have it," the figure continued, its voice laced with a dark amusement. "But you will find that power comes at a cost. You will have wealth. You will have all the material things you desire. But at what price?" The man didn't answer. He didn't know how. He could feel the power within him, but it wasn't satisfying. It was empty. He wanted to scream, to shout that it wasn't what he had imagined. But he couldn't. His mouth felt sealed shut. "Take what you desire," the figure whispered, its voice wrapping around him like a cold wind. "But understand this, you are now bound to the shadows. There is no escape." As the figure spoke, the man felt his body jerk forward, as if pulled by invisible strings. His vision blurred, and when it cleared, he was no longer in the forest. He stood in a grand, lavish room, a mansion, one he had never seen before. But it wasn't the mansion that caught his attention. It was the piles of gold and jewels, the stacks of money piled high on tables, the expensive furniture, and the fine clothing hanging in the wardrobes. Everything he had ever dreamed of, and more. For a moment, he was stunned. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that everything he had wanted, the wealth, the luxury, was now in his grasp. He could take whatever he wanted. He could have it all. But as he stepped closer to the piles of gold, something cold and bitter gnawed at him. The gold didn't shine as brightly as it should have. The jewels looked dull, lifeless. The money, though vast, felt hollow. As his fingers brushed against the riches, he felt nothing but emptiness. No joy. No excitement. The thrill he had expected never came. It was all a trap. It didn't take long for the man to realize that the wealth he had gained was not the only thing he had lost. There was something much worse that had come with the power he had sought. The air around him felt heavier, the darkness more suffocating. He had gained everything he wanted, but it felt like he had given up everything else. His body was changing. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his hands trembled. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby table, and his stomach twisted. His skin had grown pale, almost sickly. His eyes, once bright with ambition, were now hollow, as if all the life had been drained from them. The spark of humanity that had once defined him was slowly disappearing, replaced by something darker, something less human. He stumbled back, horrified by the sight of himself. How could this be? This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't worth the wealth. He had wanted power, but now, it felt as if the power was consuming him from the inside out. The riches around him, once so desirable, now seemed like chains, weighing him down with the terrible realization that he was no longer the man he used to be. A voice, cold and hollow, echoed through the room. It was the same voice he had heard earlier in the forest, the voice of the shadow creature. You thought you could escape, the voice whispered, but you cannot. You belong to the shadows now. Your soul is mine. The man's heart sank. He had made the bargain. He had given up everything for wealth, for power, and now he understood the true cost. The price of his soul had been steep, and there was no turning back. No escape. He tried to move, to break free from the mansion, but it was as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. The riches around him had become suffocating, and the shadows seemed to watch him, waiting for him to realize the truth, that there was no way out. Days, or maybe weeks, passed. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The man could no longer tell whether he was awake or dreaming. The mansion, once a symbol of everything he had ever wanted, now felt like a prison. His every move was haunted by the shadows, and the voice of the creature echoed in his mind, reminding him that there was no escape. No matter how much wealth he amassed, no matter how much power he wielded, it was all for nothing. His life had become a hollow existence. He was no longer the man he had been. He was a shell, a puppet of the shadows. His body was no longer his own, it was controlled by the curse, by the power that he had thought would set him free. And still, the shadows were always with him. They crept in the corners of the room, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. The whispers never stopped. They told him stories of those who had come before him, of men and women who had made the same choice, only to be consumed by the darkness. You are mine, the voice would say, every time the man's mind began to rebel. You sought power. Now you are nothing more than a slave to the shadows. And so he lived, in this endless cycle of wealth and power, trapped by his own greed. He had gained everything he thought he wanted, but in the end, he had lost himself. The shadows had claimed him, and there was no going back. Time became irrelevant to the man. Days blurred together into an endless cycle of emptiness and regret. The mansion, once a place of dreams and desires, now felt like a tomb, the walls pressing in on him with the weight of his own decisions. The riches that surrounded him only amplified the loneliness. He would wander the halls, running his fingers across the cold, polished surfaces, but nothing brought him comfort anymore. The opulence that had once seemed like freedom now seemed like a cage, its bars invisible yet stronger than steel. Every corner of the mansion seemed to be filled with shadows, watching, waiting. There was no escaping them. No escaping the feeling that something was always lacking just beyond his vision, just out of reach. At night, the whispers would come again, sometimes louder than before, sometimes softer, but always there. They filled his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a suffocating vine. You thought you could control power, the voice echoed in his mind one night, but power controls you. You are nothing now, just a puppet, a shadow of the man you once were. He couldn't deny it. Every day he felt himself slipping further away from the person he had been. He was losing his humanity bit by bit, and every part of him that once cared for others, for the simple joys of life, seemed to fade. All that remained was an insatiable hunger for more wealth, more power, more control. But the more he took, the emptier he felt. It was a never-ending cycle that he couldn't break. One night, as the man sat by the large fireplace, staring into the flames, something strange happened. The shadows that had always lurked in the corners of the room began to shift, moving in unnatural ways, as though they were alive. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the flames flickered, casting eerie, twisted shadows across the walls. The man's breath came out in visible puffs of mist as the chill seemed to settle deeper into his bones. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged, stepping out of the very darkness itself. The man's heart raced as the figure came closer, and he knew instinctively that this was no ordinary visitor. It was the creature, the one he had bargained with. "You are mine now," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder. Its form was shifting, dark, and shapeless, but its eyes, those same glowing red eyes, pierced through him like a blade. "You have what you wanted. You are powerful. But you will never be free." The man tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. What could he say? What could he do? His body trembled, not from the cold but from the realization that he was no longer in control of anything. "Please," the man whispered, his voice hoarse, "I didn't know. I didn't understand." The figure moved closer, its form rippling like smoke. "You think I care about your regrets?" It scoffed. "You wanted wealth. You wanted power. And now you have it. But you also have something else. Something you can never take back. You are mine, body and soul. You cannot run from me, and you cannot escape this." The man felt a deep, gnawing ache in his chest. His soul, his very being, was bound to this creature, to the shadows. There was no escape. No way to go back to the life he had before. His greed had consumed him, and now, he was nothing more than a vessel for the creature's power. "You will live for eternity," the figure continued, "but it will not be a life of luxury. It will be a life in the shadows, always feeding your hunger, always seeking more. You will never be satisfied. You will never feel whole again. And when you die, you will not be released. No, you will be bound to the darkness, just as I am." The words hit him like a hammer, breaking whatever fragile hope he had left. There was no end to this. He was trapped in this endless cycle of desire and emptiness. His life, his soul, was now the creature's to control. And the worst part was, he knew that he had chosen this. He had walked willingly into this darkness. The following days passed in a haze of despair. The mansion's walls seemed to close in on the man, its vastness now oppressive rather than liberating. No matter how much wealth he acquired, no matter how many riches piled around him, he never felt whole. Every room he entered felt the same, cold, dark, and empty. His every desire, every wish, seemed to mock him now. The more he fed his hunger for power, the emptier he became. It was a cruel irony, the very thing he had sought to make him whole was the thing that was destroying him. He could feel the creature's presence in every corner of the mansion, in every shadow. At night, when he lay in bed, it was always there, watching him. The whispers never stopped. Even when he closed his eyes, he could hear them, feel them creeping into his mind. And then there were the dreams. They came every night, without fail. The man would find himself back in the forest, standing before the altar, just as he had on the fateful night when he had first made the deal. But this time, the altar was different. The charms were gone, replaced by a mirror, a large, ornate mirror, surrounded by darkness. As he looked into the mirror, he saw himself, but it wasn't the man he was now. It was the man he used to be, young, full of hope, full of dreams. He saw the man who had once had the potential for a normal, happy life. But as he reached out to touch the mirror, his reflection twisted and warped, becoming the creature he had bargained with. The shadow stretched across the glass, enveloping his image, until the man could no longer see himself. Only the darkness remained. The man would always wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. But the dreams never stopped, and each time, they left him with a deep, gnawing emptiness. It was as if the creature was slowly taking over his soul, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the shadow. One evening, as the man sat alone in the grand hall, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, he heard a knock at the door. It was strange, no one ever visited him anymore. The mansion was too far from any village, too isolated to attract guests. The knock came again, louder this time. With a deep sigh, the man stood up and walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was met with an unexpected sight. A woman stood in the doorway. She was tall, her face obscured by a veil, but there was something about her, something familiar. "I've come for you," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. The man's heart skipped a beat. There was something in her eyes that made him feel afraid. But also something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. What started as a desperate attempt to gain wealth and power at any cost led one man down a dark and twisted path, where shadows whispered, and ancient forces clawed at his soul. The story of the man who was spotted licking charms at a Juju altar to gain wealth is not just about the dangers of greed or the allure of shortcuts to success. It's a powerful reminder that no amount of wealth, no matter how tempting, is worth the cost of one's soul. In his journey, we see a man who, blinded by his desire for quick riches, opened himself up to dark forces he could never fully understand. What he didn't realize was that the true price of power wasn't just the loss of material wealth, it was the loss of his very self. His struggle against the shadows that haunted him mirrors the struggle we all face in life, the temptation to take shortcuts, the allure of easy answers, and the battle between our desires and our true selves. But there's a twist to this tale, a message of hope. Even when we feel like we've lost everything, even when the darkness seems impossible to escape, there's always a way out. The man in this story didn't just break free from the shadows, he discovered that the real power wasn't in wealth or magic, but in the simple, quiet strength to choose a different path. A path of redemption, humility, and inner peace. In the end, this story is not just about the cost of chasing wealth, it's about the cost of our choices. We are all tempted by the easy route, the promise of things beyond our reach. But true success, the kind that doesn't destroy us, is found in the courage to walk away from those temptations and find strength in what truly matters. Whether you seek wealth, fame, or power, remember, the greatest treasure lies in choosing the right path for yourself. The man may have started with a desire for wealth, but he ended with the priceless gift of freedom, and the knowledge that no shadow can ever hold him again. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, do not forget to hit the like and subscribe button for more alluring stories. Do you think there's a price too high to pay for wealth, or is there a way to have it all without losing yourself?